Hey guys, welcome to RedSunStories. Hope you're doing well. Tonight, discover why Japan's most fortunate families heard the footsteps of children playing in empty rooms, and why, when that innocent laughter finally stops, everything they've built for generations collapses into ruin. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments what time it is for you. I would love to connect with you guys. Now, let's dive into tonight's story together. The Takahashi family had prospered for 6 generations in their old house in Tono. The silk business flourished through seasons when competitors failed. Their rice harvests were always abundant, even in years when neighbors' fields yielded poorly. Illness visited, but never lingered. Children grew healthy and strong. The house itself seemed blessed. Timbers that should have rotted remained solid. Tatami that should have worn thin stayed fresh. Storms that damaged neighboring homes always passed them by. But everyone in the family knew the real reason. Sometimes, late at night when the house settled into stillness, they heard small footsteps pattering across the tatami in the Zashiki, the guest room that no guest ever used. Sometimes they would wake to find their pillows moved several inches from where their heads had rested. Sometimes, if you were very still in that particular room at twilight, when the light came slanting through the shoji screens and golden bars, you might glimpse a small figure, 5 years old perhaps, dressed in an old-fashioned kimono of faded indigo. The child would be playing with toys no one remembered owning, building small towers of wooden blocks, rolling a ball back and forth, laughing softly to itself. If you moved, if you even breathed too loudly, the figure would vanish like morning mist touched by sun. The grandmother had seen it clearly once, decades ago when she was newly married into the family. She had smiled, bowed respectfully to the empty corner where the figure had been, and that evening left rice cakes wrapped in bamboo leaves on the threshold of the storage room. As long as the Zashiki-Warashi stays, she would tell her grandchildren in a whisper that held both reverence and sorrow, our family will thrive, but never speak of it too loudly. Never demand to see it. And always leave offerings with gratitude. She never explained who the child was or why a spirit brought fortune. The children learned not to ask. For 6 generations, the pattern held. Small footprints would appear in the morning dust near the storage room. Toys would be mysteriously rearranged. The sound of childlike giggling would echo from empty spaces. And the Takahashi family prospered beyond all their neighbors, their success so consistent, it seemed almost supernatural. Then one winter morning, everything changed. The grandmother woke and knew immediately, though she couldn't have said how. The air felt different, emptier somehow, as if a presence that had always hummed just below consciousness had suddenly gone silent. She rose, her old joints complaining, and walked slowly to the Zashiki. The room looked exactly as it always had. Tatami mats pristine, low table in the corner, scroll hanging on the wall depicting cranes in flight. But the feeling was wrong. The warmth was gone. She stood there for a long time, one hand pressed against the doorframe, and understood with terrible certainty. The child had left. No more small footprints in the morning. No more distant laughter. No more pillows mysteriously moved. The toys left as offerings remained untouched, gathering dust. The house, which had always felt somehow alive with benevolent mischief, now felt utterly ordinary. Just wood and paper and tatami. Just a house. Within 3 months, the silk business began to fail. Orders that had been reliable for decades suddenly stopped. Suppliers raised prices. A fire in the workroom destroyed half their inventory, and the insurance paid only a fraction of the loss. The grandmother's health, which had been remarkably robust for her 82 years, deteriorated rapidly. Within a year, she was gone. Within 2 years, the rice harvest failed completely. Rice blast disease that seemed to target only their fields. Within 3 years, the house stood empty. The Takahashi family scattered to distant cities. Their 6th-generation prosperity vanished as suddenly and completely as the small ghost who had guarded it. The neighbors spoke of it in whispers. The Zashiki-Warashi left, they would say with knowing nods, and everyone understood what that meant. Fortune gone. Protection withdrawn. A household that had been blessed now abandoned to ordinary fate, and ordinary fate had proven cruel. But why do these spirits come? Why do they leave? And what are they truly? These children who live in the corners of old houses, who bring fortune with their invisible presence and ruin with their departure? The answers lie in the harsh mountains of Tohoku, in stories collected by a folklorist named Kunio Yanagita, in the tales told by an old man named Kizun Sasaki, and in a tragedy so profound that communities could only speak of it through folklore, transforming horror into guardian spirits, guilt into protective ghosts, and the murdered children of desperate times into the fortune bringers of prosperous ones. This is the story of the Zashiki-Warashi, the guest room children who were never allowed to leave childhood, who play forever in empty rooms, who guard families with invisible hands, and whose departure signals the end of everything the household has built. It is a story of innocence and cruelty, of protection born from tragedy, of how the dead children of hard winters became the protective spirits of old houses. It is a story that asks difficult questions. Why do spirits of murdered children choose to guard rather than haunt? What does it mean to be a child forever? And what happens when these ancient guardians finally leave the modern world behind? Come, settle in. The tatami is soft beneath you. The shoji screens filter golden light into gentle shadow. Somewhere, in an old house in Tono, you can still hear, if you listen very carefully, the sound of small feet pattering across wooden floors, the echo of a child's laughter in empty rooms, the whisper of protection offered by those who were never protected themselves. Tonight, we remember the children in the guest rooms, the spirits beneath the floors, the fortune bringers who were never allowed to grow up. To understand the Zashiki-Warashi, you must first understand Tohoku, the northeastern region of Japan, where winter comes early and stays late, where mountains rise steep and unforgiving, where life has always been harder than in the gentle southern lands. This is where the stories come from. This is where Kunio Yanagita, a young government official turned folklorist, traveled in 1908 and 1909, listening to the tales told by Kizun Sasaki, an educated man from the remote town of Tono, who served as both informant and collaborator. In 1910, Yanagita published Tono Monogatari, The Tales of Tono, a slim volume that would become one of the most important folklore collections in Japanese history. It was in chapters 17, 18, and later in chapter 87 of the supplementary collection that Yanagita documented the stories of the Zashiki-Warashi, carefully recording what Sasaki told him about these peculiar spirits that inhabited the old houses of the region. But the stories Sasaki told, the stories Yanagita recorded, were not simple ghost tales. They were, in fact, cultural memories of something far darker, a tragedy so profound that it could only be spoken of indirectly, through the transformation of victims into guardians, through the magical thinking that turned murdered innocents into bringers of fortune. The Tohoku region, particularly during the Edo period, was a place of crushing poverty and recurring famine. The winters were brutal. Snow measured in meters, not centimeters, burying houses to their eaves, isolating villages for months at a time. The growing season was short. Rice crops failed with terrible regularity. During the worst famines, the Tenmei famine of the 1780s and the Tempo famine of the 1830s, hundreds of thousands died. Entire villages were abandoned. The living envied the dead. And in these desperate times, families made terrible calculations. How many mouths could be fed with limited rice? How many children could survive the winter? If everyone ate equally, would everyone starve? Or if some were sacrificed, could the rest live? The practice had a euphemism, mabiki, which literally means thinning, the same word used for thinning seedlings in a rice paddy to give the remaining plants room to grow. Returning children to the gods was another phrase. Sending them back was another. The language worked hard to avoid saying what it meant. Infanticide. Newborns, particularly girls, particularly in times of famine, were killed shortly after birth. The methods varied: suffocation, exposure to cold, starvation. It was quick. The parents told themselves it had to be done. The community understood. No one spoke of it directly, but everyone knew. The mathematics of survival in harsh mountains demanded it. But here is what made Tohoku different, what made the Zashiki-Warashi possible. These children were not buried in cemeteries. They were not given to temples. They were buried within the home itself, under the earthen floors, in the corners of the kitchen, beneath the storage room, sometimes even under the hearth. They were kept close, kept as part of the household, as if the family could not bear to send them away entirely, could not bear to abandon them to lonely graves in frozen ground. Kizen Sasaki told Yanagita his theory directly. The Zashiki-Warashi were the spirits of these children, infants killed and buried in the house, their souls transforming into protective guardians. They became, in death, the protectors of the families that had killed them. They brought fortune instead of vengeance. They chose to guard rather than haunt. Think of that transformation, the profound psychological mechanism at work. Communities that practiced infanticide could not simply live with the guilt unprocessed. The dead children needed a place in the cultural imagination, and so they became something precious. Spirits whose presence brought prosperity, whose departure brought ruin. The murdered innocents were reimagined as protective guardians, their terrible deaths transformed into a source of blessing. The families who had killed them now depended on them for survival. The children who had been sacrificed so siblings could live now protected those siblings and their descendants. It was, perhaps, the only way to bear it, to transform the murdered into the miraculous, to make the dead children into fortune bringers, to believe that those small bodies under the floor had not simply vanished, but had become something powerful and protective, something that chose to stay with the family rather than abandon it, something that forgave. But there was another layer to the story, another theory that Yanagita and later folklorists like Shinobu Orikuchi explored. The Tohoku region also had a tradition of taking in orphaned children, yoshi, particularly boys who could help with farm work. These children were not legally adopted, but lived with families, worked for them, and in good times were treated well. In bad times, they were the first to be sent away or neglected. Some folklore suggested that the treatment of these vulnerable children, whether a family was generous or cruel to the orphans they took in, determined whether the Zashiki-Warashi would come, would stay, would bring fortune, or withdraw it. Perhaps then, The Zashiki-Warashi represented both things: the spirits of infants killed within the home, and the memory of vulnerable children whose treatment determined a household's moral character, and thus its luck. Perhaps they were the manifestation of cultural guilt about both practices, the killing of one's own children and the mistreatment of others' children. Perhaps fortune and morality were linked, and the Zashiki-Warashi were the mechanism through which that link was understood. Whatever their true origin, and we can never know for certain, can only follow the theories of folklorists and the whispered traditions of mountain communities. The pattern was clear. The Zashiki-Warashi appeared as young children, usually around 5 or 6 years old, wearing old-fashioned kimono. They lived in the zashiki, the guest room or formal parlor, or in storage areas. They were mostly invisible, but sometimes glimpsed, particularly by children who had not yet learned that such things should not be seen. They played with toys, left small footprints, laughed softly in empty rooms, moved objects, pulled pillows from under sleeping heads, laid cold, small hands on faces in the night. They were mischievous, but never harmful, playful, but never dangerous. And as long as they remained in a house, that house prospered. Businesses flourished, harvests were abundant, children grew strong, illness passed quickly, fortune smiled on every endeavor. But when they left, when the family witnessed the small figure departing, sometimes waving goodbye with heartbreaking sadness, ruin followed with terrible certainty. Within months or years, the family would collapse. Businesses would fail. Harvests would wither. Illness would strike. The house itself would fall into disrepair and eventually collapse, as if the building itself had depended on that small spirit for its structural integrity. The Zashiki-Warashi chose which houses to inhabit and which to leave. No one knew why they came or why they departed. Families left offerings, rice cakes, toys, small dishes of food, hoping to keep them pleased and present. Some said, you should never speak directly of them, never acknowledge them too loudly, never take their presence for granted. Others said you should offer thanks quietly in the morning, leaving small gifts in the corners where footprints appeared. But ultimately, the spirits decided. And when they decided to leave, nothing could make them stay. The fortune they brought was always conditional, always fragile, always dependent on the invisible goodwill of a child who died before growing up, who played alone in empty rooms, who protected families built on tragedy, who guarded the descendants of those who had killed them or abandoned others like them. Imagine it. Imagine being 5 years old forever, playing with the same toys for centuries, watching families grow and prosper and scatter and die, generation after generation, while you remain unchanging in the corners of an old house, your laughter echoing through rooms that empty and fill and empty again, your small hands moving pillows, your small feet leaving prints in dust that accumulates and is swept away and accumulates again. Imagine protecting those who never protected you, guarding those who made you what you are, bringing fortune to houses built atop the place where you were buried as an infant, so small that your grave was just a shallow depression beneath the kitchen floor. Imagine remembering or not remembering what it was like to be alive, to be born only to be killed, to be returned to the gods before you could open your eyes fully. Imagine transforming that into protection, into choosing to stay, into bringing prosperity instead of vengeance. Imagine forgiving so completely that you become the very foundation of a family's fortune, their invisible guardian, their silent benefactor. And imagine, finally, deciding to leave, walking out of the house one morning or evening, a small figure in old-fashioned kimono, Perhaps turning back once to look at the rooms where you played for so long, perhaps waving, and then vanishing. Imagine the family watching, understanding immediately what it means, knowing with terrible certainty that their prosperity is over, that the protection is withdrawn, that the child they depended on has finally departed. Imagine the silence that follows. No more footsteps, no more laughter, no more small hands in the night. Just emptiness where mischief used to be. Just ordinary air where fortune once dwelt. This is what the Zashiki-Warashi are. Spirits of tragedy transformed into guardians. Children who were never allowed to grow up. Fortune bringers whose departure signals ruin. Playful ghosts whose presence depends on something we can neither control nor fully understand. They are the guilt and grief of communities processed through folklore. The murdered innocents reimagined as protective spirits. The eternal children in the guest rooms of old houses, playing alone, guarding silently, bringing fortune, or withdrawing it according to their own mysterious will. And in the old houses of Tono, and throughout Tohoku, in the places where winter still comes hard and memories run deep, you can still hear them if you listen carefully. The patter of small feet on tatami, the soft giggle from an empty storage room, the sound of toys being moved when no child is present, the whisper of something innocent and eternal and impossibly sad. Let us walk through the old houses where the Zashiki-Warashi lived. Let us listen to the families who prospered under their invisible guardianship. Let us understand what it meant to live with fortune dependent on the presence of a spirit, to wake each morning uncertain whether this would be the day the laughter stopped, to build a life atop a foundation as fragile as a child's laughter, as uncertain as a ghost's goodwill. The Nambu family in Tono had their Zashiki-Warashi for 4 generations. The father kept meticulous records, not of the spirit itself, for to write too directly seemed dangerous, but of the strange occurrences that marked its presence. 2nd month, 15th day, found all sleeping pillows arranged in a circle in the Zashiki, though no one had been in that room since autumn cleaning. 7th month, 3rd day, children report seeing playmate in storage room, describe child in indigo kimono, cannot explain who invited this friend. 11th month, 9th day, sack left as offering consumed, cup empty and perfectly clean, no sack spilled, no one admits to drinking. The business this family ran, a sake brewery, prospered remarkably. Their sake was renowned throughout the region for its perfect balance, its clean finish, its resistance to spoilage even in summer heat. Competitors tried to learn their methods, but there was no secret technique to steal. The rice was the same rice everyone used. The water came from the same mountain springs. The fermentation process followed traditional methods unchanged for generations. Yet somehow, the Nambu sake was always superior. Orders came from as far as Edo. The family grew wealthy. The grandmother of this household understood. She would wake sometimes in the deep night and feel a weight settle on her chest. Not heavy, not crushing, just the gentle pressure of a child climbing onto a sleeping adult, the way children do. She would lie very still, barely breathing, feeling small, cold hands touch her face gently, as if checking whether she was really sleeping or just pretending. She never opened her eyes. She never moved. She would wait until the weight lifted and the cold hands withdrew, and then she would whisper into the darkness, so softly it was almost a thought rather than words. Thank you. Thank you for staying. Thank you for watching over us. In the morning, she would place fresh rice cakes at the threshold of the storage room where she knew the spirit preferred to stay. She would leave small wooden toys she had carved herself. Simple things: a top, a ball, a little horse on wheels. She would sit in the Zashiki at twilight sometimes, when the light came slanting through the shoji in golden bars, and she would whisper stories to the empty room. Tales of the mountains, of the seasons, of the family's small happenings, as if the spirit was a child who needed to be told bedtime stories, though the child had no bed and perhaps never slept. The prosperity continued through her life, through her son's life, through her grandson's life. 4 generations of perfect sake, abundant harvests, health and fortune and peace. And then, one spring morning, the great-grandson woke, and the air felt wrong. The weight that should have been there, the sense of presence that had hummed through the house for as long as anyone could remember, was simply gone. He walked to the storage room, his heart already heavy with dread. The rice cakes from the night before were untouched. The toys sat exactly as they had been left, gathering dust. No small footprints marked the floor. No sound of childlike breathing or soft laughter echoed from the corners. The house felt ordinary for the first time in 4 generations. Just wood and paper and tatami. Just a structure. Just emptiness. Within 6 months, the sake began to spoil. Batches that should have fermented perfectly instead developed off flavors. Customers who had been loyal for decades stopped placing orders. A rival brewery somehow, no one ever understood how, acquired their most important wholesale contract. The family's fortune, so stable for so long, began to crack and crumble like old plaster. Within 2 years, they had sold the brewery at a loss. Within 5 years, the house stood empty. The family scattered to cities where they worked ordinary jobs and drank sake made by others and remembered, sometimes, the time when fortune had lived in their storage room and brought prosperity with invisible hands. This pattern repeated throughout Tono, throughout the Tohoku region, throughout all the old houses where Zashiki-Warashi chose to dwell. The specific details differed. The pranks varied. The signs of presence took different forms. The businesses and families had different names. But the essential story remained constant. Presence brought fortune. Departure brought ruin. The Sato family ran a textile business. Their Zashiki-Warashi had a fondness for playing with fabric scraps, and workers would sometimes find small dolls made from waste cloth, sewn with stitches too fine and neat to have been made by human hands. As long as they found these mysterious dolls, the business prospered. The day they stopped appearing, the textile business began its slow collapse. The Suzuki family farmed rice in the valley. Their Zashiki-Warashi liked to leave small handprints in the ash of the hearth, as if a child had been playing there during the night. The father would see these prints each morning and know the spirit remained. He would smooth the ash carefully before lighting the fire, never mentioning what he erased. His fields yielded twice what his neighbors did, year after year. Then one morning, the ash was unmarked. Within 2 seasons, rice blast disease destroyed the entire harvest, and the family lost the land to debt. The Ito family owned a mountain inn. Travelers would sometimes report hearing a child's laughter in the empty rooms, or finding their belongings mysteriously rearranged overnight, or feeling small hands pulled gently at their blankets. The inn's reputation grew. People said staying there brought good luck, and the inn was always fully booked. Then one winter, the sounds stopped. No more laughter. No more mysterious movements. No more good luck. Within 3 years, the inn had burned down under mysterious circumstances, and the Ito family had moved away. Their fortune vanished like smoke. always the same pattern, always the same trajectory from prosperity to ruin, marked by that terrible moment when the family realized the spirit had departed. Sometimes they saw it happen. A small figure in old-fashioned kimono walking out the front door at dawn or dusk, sometimes turning back to look at the house one final time, sometimes raising one small hand in what might have been farewell or might have been warning. More often, the departure was invisible, marked only by sudden absence, by the way the air felt different, by the silence where laughter used to echo, by the stillness where mischief used to dance. Why did they leave? The question haunted every family who experienced it, haunted the communities who watched it happen again and again. Had the family displeased the spirit somehow? Had they failed to leave proper offerings? Had they spoken of it too directly, acknowledged its presence too loudly? Had someone in the family done something cruel, something the spirit could not forgive? Or was it simply time? Did these spirits have their own incomprehensible reasons, their own cycles of staying and leaving, that had nothing to do with human behavior? Some families tried everything to make them stay. They left elaborate offerings, not just rice cakes, but special sweets, expensive toys, silk cloth, even small amounts of gold. They whispered apologies to empty rooms. They promised to be better, to be kinder, to honor the spirit more faithfully. But once the departure began, it could not be stopped. Once the silence settled, it could not be broken. The Zashiki-Warashi left according to their own mysterious will, and nothing the family did could change their minds. And yet, here is the terrible beauty of it. While they stayed, while they chose to remain, their protection was absolute. Families with Zashiki-Warashi did not just prosper moderately. They prospered remarkably, consistently, in ways that seemed to defy ordinary fortune. Their businesses flourished when competitors failed. Their harvests exceeded all neighbors. Their children grew healthy when others sickened. It was as if the spirits channeled all the fortune that should have been spread across many households into these particular ones, concentrating prosperity, focusing luck, creating islands of success in seas of ordinary struggle. The presence of a Zashiki-Warashi was like having fortune itself choose to live in your house, to share your tatami rooms, to play in your storage spaces. It was the universe deciding to smile on you specifically, consistently, remarkably. And all it required in return was offerings of rice cakes and toys, whispered acknowledgement, respectful silence about the source of your good luck, and the acceptance that this fortune could vanish at any moment, that the child in your guest room might decide tomorrow to leave, and when it did, everything you had built would begin to crumble. Living with a Zashiki-Warashi meant living with both perfect security and perfect uncertainty. As long as you heard the footsteps, you were blessed. As long as you felt the small hands in the night, you were protected. As long as the laughter echoed from empty rooms, your fortune was secure. But you never knew, never could know, whether tomorrow would be the day the laughter stopped, whether the next morning you would wake to find the air empty, the offerings untouched, the guardian departed, and your prosperity beginning its inevitable collapse. It was fortune built on the most fragile foundation imaginable, the goodwill of a child who was never allowed to grow up, who died before living, who chose for incomprehensible reasons to protect rather than haunt, to bring fortune rather than grief. But who could at any moment change that choice, walk out the door one dawn, wave goodbye with one small hand, and leave you to face ordinary fate with whatever you had managed to accumulate while the blessing lasted? This was the gift and curse of the Zashiki-Warashi, absolute fortune that could vanish absolutely, protection that was simultaneously permanent and temporary, guardianship offered by spirits who owed you nothing, who had every reason to haunt rather than help, but who chose, for their own mysterious reasons, to stay in your house, to play in your empty rooms, to bring prosperity with their invisible presence, to guard your family with small, cold hands, to make your fortune dependent on something you could neither control nor fully understand. And in the old houses that remained, in the families who still whispered the stories, in the communities that remembered the pattern, everyone understood. If you heard the laughter, if you felt the hands, if you saw the small footprints, you were blessed beyond measure. And if the laughter stopped, if the hands withdrew, if the footprints vanished, everything was already ending. All that remained was to watch the slow collapse, to scatter to other places, to remember the time when a child spirit had chosen to protect you, and to wonder for the rest of your life why it had left. The tatami remembers the footsteps even after they stop falling. The shoji screens still filter golden light into the same patterns. The storage rooms still have corners where toys used to be mysteriously rearranged. But the houses are empty now, or filled with people who hear nothing, see nothing, feel nothing of what used to be there. The Zashiki-Warashi have departed, and with them went the fortune they brought, the protection they offered, the prosperity they channeled into households that could never quite believe their good luck would last, and were proven right when it didn't. There is a particular quality to silence, not the absence of sound, but the absence of something that should be there, like the space where a tooth has been pulled, where your tongue keeps returning to probe the emptiness, like the moment after a clock that has ticked for years suddenly stops, and you only notice its absence when the stillness becomes oppressive, like waking in a house where a child has always lived, and realizing, with sudden terrible certainty, that the child is gone. This is what families reported when the Zashiki-Warashi departed. Not noise, but its absence. Not presence, but the hole where presence used to be. The Watanabe family lived in an old farmhouse at the edge of Tono, a structure that had stood for 8 generations. The wood was dark with age and smoke. The tatami, though carefully maintained, bore the indentations of centuries of living. The roof thatch had been replaced so many times that no one remembered what the original looked like. This house had seen births and deaths, weddings and funerals, prosperity and hardship, but through all of it, one thing remained constant: the Zashiki-Warashi in the north storage room. The current grandmother had grown up with it. As a child, she had been one of the few who could actually see the spirit clearly. A small boy, she thought, though it was hard to tell. 5 or 6 years old, wearing a kimono of faded blue-gray, with serious dark eyes that watched everything with ancient patience. She had tried to play with him once, offering to share her dolls, but he had simply smiled, a sad, knowing smile that seemed wrong on a child's face, and vanished like breath on cold air. As she grew older, she saw him less frequently, until finally, like most adults, she could only sense his presence. The sound of footsteps when no one was walking, the feeling of being watched from empty corners, the small disturbances that marked his invisible play. But she never forgot those serious eyes, that sad smile. She understood, in a way she could never articulate, that the spirit was not playing from joy, but from something closer to duty, that his laughter was not innocent delight, but a performance of childhood, by something that had never truly been a child, or had been one so briefly. that only the form remained, not the substance. The Watanabe family prospered under his guardianship. Not spectacularly. They were farmers, and farmers' fortunes have limits, but reliably. The harvests were always sufficient. The livestock stayed healthy. The tools never broke at critical moments. When the father needed to borrow money for a new irrigation system, a distant relative unexpectedly offered a generous loan. When the daughter fell ill with fever, it broke after 3 days instead of lingering into pneumonia as happened to the neighbor's child. Small things, perhaps, but small things accumulated into security, into the ability to survive bad years and capitalize on good ones, into 8 generations of continuous family presence on the same land. The grandmother left offerings faithfully, rice cakes twice a month, fresh fruit when they had it, small wooden toys she bought at the market in Tono. She would place them at the threshold of the north storage room and whisper her thanks into the dimness. She never entered that room without announcing herself first, never rearranged anything inside, never questioned the small disturbances she found. The toys moved into new configurations. The rice cakes vanished, the sense that someone small had been there recently. She taught her granddaughter to do the same. "The child protects us," she would say, choosing her words carefully. "As long as he stays, we can stay. Respect him, thank him, but do not demand anything. Do not take his presence for granted. He is not ours to keep. He is a guest, even though he has been here for 200 years. He can leave whenever he chooses." And one morning in late autumn, when mist hung thick in the valley and the persimmons glowed like small suns on bare branches, the grandmother woke and knew immediately that he had left. She lay very still in her futon, barely breathing, trying to sense what she knew she would not find. The house felt different, not wrong exactly, but fundamentally changed. The hum of presence that had always lived below consciousness was simply gone. The air that had always felt slightly inhabited now felt empty. She rose slowly, her old body protesting, and walked to the north storage room with heavy steps and heavier heart. The door was slightly open. She did not remember leaving it that way. Inside, the room looked exactly as it always had. Shelves of stored rice, old farming tools, boxes of family records, the small shrine in the corner. The offerings she had left 3 days before sat untouched. A wooden toy horse lay on its side, undisturbed. No small footprints marked the dust. No sense of occupation lingered in the air. She knelt slowly at the threshold, her knees complaining, and pressed her forehead to the floor in a deep bow to the empty room. "Thank you," she whispered, though whether to the departed spirit or to the room itself, or to the 200 years of guardianship that had just ended, she could not have said. "Thank you for all the years. Thank you for protecting us. Thank you for staying as long as you did." There was no answer. There would never be an answer again. The child was gone. She told her son that day. He stood in the farmyard, looking at the old house, and she saw understanding settle on his face like dust. "How long?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "Months maybe, a year, perhaps longer if we are fortunate, but it has begun." And it had. The harvest that year was adequate but not abundant. 2 of their best laying hens died suddenly of no obvious cause. The irrigation system developed a leak that took weeks to find and fix. The father injured his back lifting a heavy stone, not seriously, but seriously enough that he could not work for a week, which had never happened before. Small things, manageable things. But the accumulation had changed. Instead of small, fortunate events piling up into security, Small, unfortunate events began piling up into instability. The next year was worse. The harvest was poor, not disastrous, but noticeably less than previous years, less than the neighbors. The son's wife became pregnant but miscarried at 4 months, which the doctor said sometimes happened, but which had never happened in 8 generations of Watanabe pregnancies. The father's back injury, which should have healed, became chronic. The distant relative called in the loan, suddenly, without explanation. The grandmother died in the winter of that second year. She had been 86, and her death was not unexpected, but everyone knew what it signified. The generation that had known the Zashiki-Warashi, that had understood the protection, was passing. She was buried in the family plot overlooking the valley, and as they lowered her casket into the ground, the family stood together and looked back at the old farmhouse, silent on its hillside, and understood that its time was ending. By the 3rd year, the family had decided to sell the farm and move to the city. The decision was presented as practical: better opportunities for the grandchildren, modern amenities, easier life. But everyone knew the real reason. The house that had sheltered 8 generations was no longer sheltering them. The protection had lifted. The fortune had departed. The small spirit in the north storage room had left, and with him had gone everything that made the struggle of rural farming life sustainable. The day they moved away, the grandmother's granddaughter, now a grown woman with children of her own, stood alone in the empty house one final time. She walked through the rooms where she had grown up, through the spaces that had once hummed with presence, and ended at the north storage room. The door was open. Afternoon light fell through the small window in dusty golden bars. The room was empty now. The family had taken everything except a few broken tools and some boxes of old records no one wanted. She knelt at the threshold, as her grandmother had taught her, and whispered into the emptiness. "Where did you go? Why did you leave us? Didn't we honor you? Didn't we thank you? Didn't we leave offerings faithfully for 200 years? Her voice broke on the questions. What did we do wrong? The room, of course, gave no answer. Rooms never do. But in the silence, in the golden dust-moted light, she thought she heard something, or remembered hearing something, or imagined hearing something. The ghost of laughter, distant and sad. The echo of small footsteps that had once pattered across these floors. The whisper of something that had been present for so long that its absence was more substantial than most presences, more real than most realities. She bowed deeply to the empty room, touching her forehead to the dusty floor, and whispered, "Thank you. Forgive us. We will remember." Then she rose and walked out of the house for the last time, leaving it to stand empty on the hillside, another structure that had lost its spirit, another family home that had become just a house, another 8-generation prosperity ended by the departure of a child who had never grown up, who had protected for 2 centuries, and who had left for reasons no one would ever understand. This story repeated throughout Tohoku in countless variations. The Yamada family lost their Zashiki-Warashi, and within 5 years, their 3-generation ironworks business had collapsed. The Kobayashi family woke one morning to silence, and within 2 years, their traditional inn, which had hosted travelers for 150 years, burned to the ground in an accidental fire. The Ishikawa family felt the departure and within 4 years had scattered to 4 different cities, the old house standing empty, then collapsing inward during a heavy snow. Always the same pattern, the sudden absence, the slow unraveling, the family's dissolution, the house standing empty and then collapsing as if the building itself, had depended on the spirit for its structural integrity, as if prosperity was not just luck or hard work, but something more fundamental, the active protection of a guardian who had chosen that house, that family, for incomprehensible reasons, and who had chosen, for equally incomprehensible reasons, to finally leave. The devastating thing was not just the loss of fortune, but the loss of meaning. While the Zashiki-Warashi stayed, families could interpret their success as evidence of spiritual favor, as proof that they were blessed, as confirmation that despite the harsh world and hard life, something innocent and powerful watched over them. Their prosperity had meaning beyond economics. It was protection, guardianship, the embrace of something that had transcended its own tragedy to offer care to others. When the spirits left, that meaning collapsed. Prosperity revealed itself as temporary, conditional, dependent on forces beyond control or understanding. The families were not blessed. They had simply been inhabited, and now they were not. Their fortune was not deserved or earned. It was granted, and now it was withdrawn. They were left with ordinary fate, ordinary struggle, and the bitter knowledge that for generations they had lived under protection they had not fully appreciated until it was gone. And perhaps worst of all, the silence, the absence of small footsteps, the missing laughter, the empty corners where eyes used to watch from shadows, the unmoved pillows, the undisturbed toys, the complete and utter ordinariness of a house that had once been more than a house, that had once held something precious and protective and impossible to keep. The families who experienced this loss would sometimes, years later, living in small city apartments far from the old houses, wake in the night and listen for footsteps that would never come again. They would turn their pillows and wish someone would mysteriously move them. They would leave rice cakes on windowsills and know, with sad certainty, that they would remain untouched. They would tell their children about the houses they left behind, about the spirits that protected them, about the prosperity that depended on something invisible and precious and fragile as a child's laugh, and the children would listen with the polite skepticism of modern people, and the parents would not insist, would not try too hard to make them believe, because what did it matter now? The Zashiki-Warashi were gone. The protection was ended. The old houses stood empty or collapsed entirely. All that remained was memory, the memory of feeling watched by something benevolent, the memory of small pranks that signified guardianship, the memory of fortune that felt like more than luck, the memory of knowing something impossibly innocent lived in your storage room and brought prosperity with invisible hands, and the devastating memory of the morning when that presence suddenly was not there anymore, would never be there again, and everything built on its protection began, so quickly, so certainly, to crumble and fall. The silence after the laughter stops is not peaceful. It is not restful. It is the silence of absence, of loss, of everything ending, of understanding too late what you had and how fragile it was. It is the silence of a house that has lost its soul, of a family that has lost its guardian, of fortune departing on small feet you can no longer hear, leaving nothing behind but empty rooms and the unbearable knowledge that something precious was here, and now it is gone, and you do not even know where it went. In some families, the departure was witnessed directly. The Tanaka family of Tono tells a story passed down through 4 generations now, a story that has become part of their family identity, though the family itself no longer lives in the old house where it happened. It was the grandfather who saw it, or rather, the man who would become the grandfather, for he was only 23 at the time, newly married, living in his family's old house, where 7 generations had prospered. He had grown up hearing the footsteps, feeling the occasional cold touch in the night, finding his pillow mysteriously moved. He had accepted it as natural as he accepted the roof over his head or the floor under his feet. The Zashiki-Warashi was simply part of the house, part of his life, part of his family's continuing prosperity. That morning, he woke before dawn, as farmers do, and went to the kitchen to start the fire for tea. The house was dark and still. Frost made patterns on the shoji screens. His breath misted in the cold air. He was thinking about the day's work, the field that needed plowing, the fence that needed mending, when he heard the sound. Footsteps. Small, light footsteps pattering across the tatami in the zashiki. This was not unusual. He had heard these footsteps countless times throughout his life. But something about the pattern was different. The steps were not playful or random. They were purposeful, deliberate, moving in one direction, toward the front door. He set down the kettle he had been filling and walked quietly toward the sound. The zashiki door was open. He did not remember it being open the night before. The room was dim with pre-dawn grayness, and there, clearly visible in that strange twilight before sunrise, he saw the child. A small boy, perhaps 6 years old, wearing a kimono of faded indigo. The figure was translucent, not quite solid, not quite vapor, something in between, like looking at something through water or old glass. The boy was walking toward the front entrance, moving with that same purposeful deliberation he had heard in the footsteps. His small feet made no sound on the wood floor. The pattering sound continued, but did not match the footsteps, as if the sound and the sight were slightly out of synchronization, as if what he was seeing and what he was hearing were 2 different layers of the same phenomenon. "Wait," the young man whispered, his voice catching in his throat. "Please wait." The child stopped. Slowly, very slowly, he turned, and for the first time in 7 generations, someone in the Tanaka family looked directly into the face of their guardian spirit. The face was a child's face, round cheeks, small nose, dark eyes, but the expression was ancient. There was sorrow in those eyes, and weariness, and something that might have been apology, or might have been farewell, or might have been both. The child looked at the young man for a long moment, and in that moment, the young man understood everything. Understood that this spirit had been a real child once, had died in this house, had been buried under these floors, had chosen for 7 generations to protect rather than haunt, to bring fortune rather than vengeance, and now, for reasons beyond mortal understanding, had decided that time was over. "Why?" the young man asked, and his voice broke on the word. "Why are you leaving? What did we do? How can we make you stay?" The child spirit shook his head slowly. When he spoke, his voice was tiny and distant, like wind through pine needles, like water over stones, like something from impossibly far away. "Time. All things end. Even this." "Please," the young man said, taking a step forward, hands outstretched as if to physically stop the departure. "Please don't go. We need you. We have always needed you. We are grateful. We remember. Please." But the child was already fading. The translucent form became more translucent, the outline less distinct. For just a moment, the spirit raised one small hand. Whether in farewell or blessing or simple acknowledgement, the young man never knew. And then, the figure dissolved completely, like mist touched by sun, like frost melting, like a dream upon waking. The young man stood alone in the entrance hall, his hand still outstretched toward nothing, and felt the house change around him. The air that had always held a particular quality, a sense of occupation, of benevolent watching, became ordinary air. The silence that had always contained the possibility of distant laughter became absolute silence. The shadows that had always seemed slightly inhabited became just shadows. He stood there for a long time, long enough for the dawn to come properly, for the frost to begin melting, for his wife to wake and call his name questioningly from the bedroom. And when he finally moved, finally lowered his outstretched hand, finally turned away from the empty entrance hall, he knew with absolute certainty that his family's 7 generations of prosperity had just ended, that the protection was gone, that everything was already beginning to fall apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He told his wife. She wept. He told his father. The old man closed his eyes and nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this, had known it would come eventually, had simply hoped it would not be in his lifetime. They discussed whether to tell the rest of the family, whether to tell the neighbors, whether to try to prepare for what was coming. In the end, they told no one. What could anyone do? The spirit had left. The protection was withdrawn. All that remained was to endure what followed. And what followed was precisely what followed for every family that lost their Zashiki-Warashi. The rice crop that year was poor. The following year, the father died suddenly of a heart attack at only 62. The year after that, the young man's first child was stillborn. The debts accumulated. The harvests diminished. Within 7 years, the same number of generations the spirit had protected them, the family had sold the land and moved to a small house in the city. The old house stood empty for a decade, then collapsed during a heavy snow. When the young man, now middle-aged, working in a factory, living in a concrete apartment, heard about the collapse, he went back to Tono to see it. The structure had fallen inward, the roof beams crushed down onto the tatami rooms, the walls split and scattered. He stood looking at the ruins of 7 generations, and he thought about that dawn when he had seen the child spirit walking toward the door, about that ancient sorrow in young eyes, about that tiny, distant voice saying, "Time, all things end, even this." He wanted to be angry, wanted to curse the spirit for abandoning them after 7 generations of faithful offerings and grateful acknowledgement. But he couldn't. Because he had seen the weariness in those eyes, had understood in that moment that the spirit had been tired, so tired. How long had it protected them? How many years of playing alone in empty rooms, of moving pillows, of pattering across tatami, of watching families grow and change while remaining forever 5 or 6 years old? How long before protection became burden, guardianship became imprisonment, the house became not a home, but a cage of obligation? Perhaps, he thought, standing in the ruins of his childhood, the Zashiki-Warashi had not abandoned them. Perhaps they had finally released it. Perhaps after 7 generations of service, the child spirit had earned rest, had earned departure, had earned the right to stop protecting, and finally, move on to whatever came next for spirits of murdered infants who chose guardianship over vengeance. He bowed deeply to the ruins, to the place where the storage room had been, to the ground beneath which, somewhere, somehow, a small body had been buried 200 years ago by desperate parents who could not feed another mouth. "Thank you," he whispered to the collapsed house, to the departed spirit, to the 7 generations of protection that had been given freely and had ended when it needed to end. "Thank you. Rest now. You have done enough. More than enough. You are released." The ruins gave no answer. The wind moved through the broken beams. Snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering the collapsed structure in white, erasing the outline, transforming the wreckage into something almost peaceful. The man stood there until the cold became unbearable, then walked back to the road, back to the bus that would take him back to the city, back to his ordinary life with its ordinary struggles, carrying with him the memory of a child spirit walking toward the door one dawn, the memory of ancient sorrow in young eyes, the memory of 7 generations ended, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest kindness is letting go. Imagine being 5 years old forever. Imagine the world seen always from that height, always with that size, always with that curious mixture of innocence and incomprehension that defines early childhood. Imagine playing alone, always alone, in empty rooms that are sometimes warm with family presence and sometimes cold with absence. Imagine watching families grow, children becoming adults, adults becoming elders, elders dying, new children being born, while you remain unchanging, unchangeable, locked in the form you wore when you died or when you transformed from death into something else. This is what it means to be a Zashiki-Warashi. This is the eternal condition of the guest room children, the spirits under the floors, the guardians who were never allowed to guard themselves. We do not know, truly, what they experience. We cannot know. But the stories give us hints, fragments, glimpses into what that existence might be like. The loneliness must be profound. Children are meant to grow, to change, to learn, to become. But the Zashiki-Warashi are trapped in stasis, eternally 5, eternally 6, eternally playing with the same toys, eternally pattering across the same tatami, eternally inhabiting the same rooms. They watch human children grow past them. Watch those children have children of their own. Watch generations cycle through while they remain fixed. The families change, but the spirits do not. The houses age, but the spirits stay young. Everything moves forward except them, and yet they play. The stories are consistent on this point. The Zashiki-Warashi are playful, mischievous, fond of small pranks and gentle disturbances. They move pillows. They rearrange toys. They leave footprints. They touch faces with cold, small hands. They laugh in empty rooms. This is not the behavior of traumatized ghosts seeking vengeance. This is the behavior of children trying to be children, trying to enact childhood even though the substance of childhood, growth, discovery, future, is forever denied them. Perhaps the play is their way of maintaining some connection to what they might have been. Perhaps moving objects and making sounds is how they remind themselves they still exist, still have some effect on the physical world, still matter in some small way. Perhaps the pranks are their form of communication, their way of saying, I am here, I am still here, please acknowledge that I am here. Or perhaps the play is simply what they know. If they died as infants, if they were killed before they could form memories or understand the world, perhaps all they have is the instinct to play, the deep mammalian drive that makes young creatures explore and manipulate their environment. Perhaps they are not choosing to be playful. Perhaps play is simply their nature, and they enact it eternally, without truly understanding what they do or why. The question of consciousness haunts these stories. Are the Zashiki-Warashi aware? Do they remember being alive? Do they know they are dead? Do they understand that they are spirits? Or do they simply exist in an eternal present, playing in rooms that sometimes contain families and sometimes do not, moving objects without understanding why, laughing without remembering what laughter means. Some accounts suggest awareness. The child spirit who spoke to the young Tanaka man, time, all things end, even this, demonstrated consciousness, understanding, even philosophical acceptance. The Zashiki-Warashi, who turned back to look at the house one final time before departing, showed awareness of significance, of ending, of farewell. These are not unconscious phenomena. These are beings making choices, experiencing something like emotion, operating from something like will. But other accounts suggest otherwise. Many families report that the spirits seem to follow patterns rather than making choices, always moving pillows the same way, always leaving footprints in the same locations, always laughing at the same times. This behavior seems more mechanical, more ritualistic, as if the spirits are replaying the same actions endlessly, not from choice but from some kind of spiritual programming, some echo of being that has worn grooves in the fabric of the house itself. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps there are moments of consciousness and moments of pure pattern. Perhaps the Zashiki-Warashi drift in and out of awareness, sometimes understanding what they are and what they do, sometimes simply existing in a dreamlike state where actions happen without thought, where centuries pass like single nights, where the distinction between being and not being becomes meaningless. What is certain is that they protect. Whatever their level of consciousness, whatever their inner experience, the pattern is consistent. Houses with Zashiki-Warashi prosper. The mechanism is unclear. The stories do not explain how a child spirit brings fortune, what actual process causes businesses to flourish and harvests to be abundant. Is it actual supernatural intervention? Do the spirits somehow manipulate probability, channel luck, influence events? Or is the protection more subtle? Does their presence create a sense of being watched, of obligation to honor their guardianship? And does that sense inspire families to work harder, to be more careful, to make better choices? Or perhaps, and this is the darkest possibility, the prosperity is not caused by the spirits at all. Perhaps the correlation is reversed. Perhaps prosperous families are simply more likely to believe in Zashiki-Warashi, to interpret random good fortune as spiritual protection, to maintain the rituals and offerings that reinforce the belief. And when prosperity ends, as it inevitably must for most families in a harsh region with difficult conditions, the departure of the spirit becomes the explanation, the story that makes sense of senseless loss. But this explanation feels insufficient when you read the accounts. When you see the consistency of the pattern across hundreds of families, across centuries of stories, across a region where these beliefs were deeply embedded in cultural consciousness, when you read about families who witnessed the departure and then experienced immediate collapse, when you hear about houses that fell apart as if the physical structure itself had depended on the spiritual presence, the correlation feels too strong, too consistent, too specific to be mere coincidence or wishful interpretation. Perhaps the truth is that we cannot know. Perhaps the Zashiki-Warashi exist in a space beyond our ordinary categories of real and unreal, conscious and unconscious, causal and coincidental. Perhaps they are precisely what the folklore says they are, the spirits of children who died tragically, who transformed their tragedy into protection, who guard families from their small corners of old houses, who bring fortune through incomprehensible mechanisms, and who depart when their time of guardianship is finished, leaving devastation in their wake. What would it be like to make that choice, if it is a choice? To die as an infant, killed by parents desperate with hunger, or abandoned in harsh winter, or stillborn from malnutrition, and then to somehow transform that death into guardianship, to become the protector of the family that killed you, or of the community that allowed your death, or of the descendants of those who failed to save you, to spend centuries in the house where you were buried, playing alone in empty rooms, watching generations cycle through, bringing prosperity through your presence, holding back misfortune through your small, invisible hands. Is that forgiveness? Is that the ultimate expression of innocence? To be incapable of vengeance, to respond to murder with protection, to transform victimhood into guardianship? Or is it something darker, eternal servitude, the murdered child forever bound to serve the murderers, the ultimate exploitation extending beyond death into endless afterlife? The folklore does not answer these questions. The stories do not explain the spirit's motivations. We are left with the phenomenon itself, children who died becoming children who protect, and with the question of what that transformation means. Perhaps for the Zashiki-Warashi themselves, there is no meaning. Perhaps they simply exist, playing in corners, moving objects, laughing softly, bringing fortune or being correlated with it, and departing when the time comes, without understanding or choosing any of it. Perhaps consciousness and will are human projections onto phenomena we cannot fully comprehend. Perhaps the spirits are more like natural forces than persons, like wind or rain, operating according to their own internal logic, indifferent to human interpretation. Or perhaps they are deeply aware. Perhaps they understand everything, their origin, their nature, their effect, their choice. Perhaps they chose protection consciously, deliberately, as an act of radical forgiveness or profound compassion, or simply because they could not bear to haunt, could not bear to add more suffering to a world already full of it. Perhaps they are the murdered children who decided to be better than their circumstances, who transformed their tragedy into grace, who spent centuries guarding families who never fully understood what they were guarding them from or what that guardianship cost. And when they depart, when they finally walk out the door one dawn, when they finally stop pattering across tatami, when they finally withdraw their small cold hands and let the fortune they brought slip away. Perhaps that is also a choice. Perhaps after enough centuries, even the most compassionate spirit grows tired. Even the most forgiving heart reaches its limit. Even the most patient guardian decides that enough is enough, that they have served long enough, protected well enough, brought sufficient fortune to balance their tragic death. Or perhaps the departure is not a choice at all. Perhaps the spirits fade naturally, like all things fade. Perhaps the houses become too modern, too changed from what they were, and the spirits cannot inhabit concrete and steel the way they inhabited wood and paper and tatami. Perhaps the families become too different, too distant from the communities that created the spirits through their desperate acts and their guilty folklore. Perhaps the world simply moves on, and the Zashiki-Warashi, who belong to old Tohoku, to harsh winters and desperate calculations, to the time when children were returned to the gods so other children could live, cannot exist in a Japan where such things are no longer thinkable, no longer necessary, no longer part of the cultural landscape. Whatever the truth, and we cannot know the truth, can only circle around it with stories and theories and imagination. The Zashiki-Warashi remain one of the most poignant figures in Japanese folklore. Eternal children playing in empty rooms, protective spirits born from tragedy, fortune bringers who were never fortunate themselves, guardians who needed guarding, children who will never grow up, never change, never escape the houses where they died, where they were buried, where they transformed into something that chose to protect rather than haunt, to bring prosperity rather than vengeance, to remain when they could have vanished, and to finally leave when the time for leaving came. Listen carefully in the old houses. Sit very still in the Zashiki at twilight when dust motes float in golden light. Feel the tatami beneath you. Smell the faint scent of aged wood and paper. Watch the shadows gather in the corners. And perhaps you will hear the patter of small feet, the distant echo of childlike laughter, the whisper of something that was 5 years old 200 years ago and is 5 years old still, playing alone, guarding silently, bringing fortune with hands too small to hold anything at all, waiting for the day when waiting finally ends and the eternal child can finally walk out the door and find whatever peace exists for spirits who served faithfully, who forgave completely, who protected endlessly, and who departed when departing was all that remained to do. In modern Tohoku, there are still houses that claim to have Zashiki-Warashi. Traditional inns, particularly in Iwate Prefecture, advertise the presence of these spirits as part of their appeal. Guests book rooms hoping to hear footsteps, hoping to feel cold hands in the night, hoping to wake with their pillows mysteriously moved. The encounter with a Zashiki-Warashi has become something people seek rather than something they simply accept as part of living in old houses. The Ryokan Kikaku in Tono is perhaps the most famous. The inn has stood for over 200 years, though it has been renovated multiple times, modernized carefully to preserve the traditional feeling while adding contemporary comforts. The owners speak openly about their Zashiki-Warishi, a young girl spirit, they say, who lives in the north wing, who is particularly active in the room at the end of the second-floor corridor. Guests report phenomena: pillows moved during the night, sounds of children playing in the hallway when the corridor is empty, the sense of being watched by something benevolent, small toys left as offerings, traditional wooden dolls, spinning tops, little balls, mysteriously rearranged. Some guests claim to have seen glimpses of a small figure in old-fashioned kimono, there for a moment at the edge of vision, vanishing when looked at directly. The owner, an elderly man whose family has operated the inn for 5 generations, speaks of the spirit with affection and careful respect. "She has been here as long as anyone remembers," he says. "Perhaps longer. We leave offerings, rice cakes on the 1st and 15th of each month, toys for her to play with, fresh flowers in her corner. She protects the inn. We have never had a serious fire, never had a guest seriously injured, never had a year when we could not meet our obligations. This is her doing, we believe. We are grateful." But he also speaks carefully, choosing his words with the caution of someone who understands the fragility of the relationship. "We do not take her presence for granted. We know she could leave. Old houses throughout Tohoku have lost their Zashiki-Warashi. The spirits depart, and the houses fall into ruin. We hope she will stay. We try to honor her, but we understand that if she chooses to leave, there is nothing we can do to prevent it. Fortune is always temporary. Protection is always conditional. We are fortunate for as long as she remains, and we will accept with gratitude whatever years she chooses to give us." Does the Zashiki-Warashi still exist in Ryokan Kikaku? The guests report phenomena, but skeptics note that traditional inns are full of settling sounds, that old buildings creak and groan, that pillows slide on smooth sheets, that light and shadow play tricks on sleepy eyes. The phenomena could be explained naturally. The belief could be maintained through suggestion and expectation. guests who come hoping to encounter a spirit interpret ordinary events as supernatural confirmation. And yet, some guests report experiences that seem harder to dismiss. A businessman from Tokyo, a self-described skeptic who booked the room as a lark, woke at 3 in the morning to see a small girl standing at the foot of his futon, watching him with serious dark eyes. He sat up, reaching for the light switch, and she vanished completely, not running away, but simply not existing anymore, as if she had been a projection and someone had turned off the projector. He left the next morning, paid in full, and never returned. When asked about the experience later, he refused to discuss it, would only say, "I saw something I don't have an explanation for. I prefer not to think about it." A family visiting from Sendai left toys for the spirit. A set of small wooden animals, beautifully carved, expensive. In the morning, the mother found the toys arranged in a perfect circle, each animal facing inward as if in conversation. She had placed them in a row against the wall before sleeping. No one had entered the room. The door was locked from inside, the windows sealed. Her young daughter claimed to have woken during the night and seen the girl with the sad face playing with the toys, arranging them carefully, then looking up at the daughter and putting one finger to her lips in a gesture of silence before fading away like breath on glass. These modern encounters have a different quality from the old stories. In traditional accounts, the Zashiki-Warashi were accepted as part of the house, integrated into daily life, their presence taken for granted even as their importance was understood. Families lived with the spirits without seeking them, experienced their effects without analyzing them, accepted their protection without demanding proof. Modern encounters are self-conscious. Guests come looking for the spirits, hoping for phenomena, disappointed if nothing happens. The relationship has changed from coexistence to tourism, from integrated belief to nostalgic seeking. The spirits, if they remain, are no longer part of ordinary life, but attractions, curiosities, phenomena, to be experienced and photographed and posted about on social media. Does this change affect the spirits themselves? If the Zashiki-Warashi are psychological phenomena, manifestations of cultural belief, collective wish fulfillment, stories that maintain themselves through repetition and expectation, then perhaps modern skepticism and tourism dilute their reality, make them less substantial, less powerful, less able to maintain the presence that sustained them for centuries. But if the spirits are real, actual entities, actual consciousness, actual supernatural presence, then perhaps they withdraw, not because belief has changed, but because the houses themselves have changed, because the world has changed, because they belong to old Tohoku, to desperate times, to communities that processed collective trauma through protective folklore, and that world no longer exists. Traditional houses are disappearing throughout Tohoku. The region's population declines as young people move to cities. Old farmhouses stand empty, their tatami rotting, their shoji torn, their timbers collapsing. The houses where Zashiki-Warashi lived for generations fall apart without families to maintain them, without the daily life that gave the spirits purpose and context. Where do the spirits go when their houses collapse? Can they move to new locations, or are they tied to the specific structure where they died, where they were buried, where they transformed from corpse to guardian? If the house falls, does the spirit vanish with it, or does it linger in the ruins, trapped and purposeless, waiting for something that will never return? These questions haunt the remaining believers, the people who maintain traditional houses, who leave offerings in empty storage rooms, who listen for footsteps that grow fainter each year. They understand that they are witnessing the end of something, the end of a type of house, a type of family structure, a type of relationship between human and spirit that cannot be maintained in modern Japan with its apartments and nuclear families and urban migration. Some families fight to preserve the old houses. They pour money into maintaining timbers and tatami, into keeping the structure traditional, even as it becomes increasingly difficult and expensive to do so. They tell themselves they are preserving cultural heritage, maintaining historical buildings, honoring their ancestors. But underneath is often the unspoken belief, or hope, or fear, that they are maintaining the house for the spirit, keeping it ready for the Zashiki-Warashi that might still be there, that might still be protecting them, that might leave if the house is modernized or abandoned. Others let the houses go. They move to cities, sell the land to developers, watch the old structures demolished and replaced with efficient modern buildings. They tell themselves that folklore is just folklore, that belief in spirits is superstition, that fortune and misfortune have natural explanations. But some of them, lying awake in their city apartments, hearing only the sounds of traffic and neighbors and modern life, sometimes miss the feeling of old houses, the sense of being watched by something benevolent, the possibility of small footsteps in the night, the comfort of believing that something innocent and powerful protected them, even if they never quite understood why. The tension between preservation and progress, between belief and skepticism, between honoring the past and embracing the future, plays out across Tohoku in countless individual decisions. Each family with an old house must decide whether to maintain it or let it go, whether to honor the spirits or dismiss them, whether to risk offending guardians that might not exist or risk losing protection that might be real. And the Zashiki-Warashi, if they still exist, if they ever existed, watch these decisions from their corners, from their storage rooms, from their eternal childhood, and make their own decisions in response. They stay or they leave, they protect or they withdraw. According to logic, humans cannot fully understand. Following patterns we can observe but not explain. Departing when the time for departure comes, and leaving behind only empty rooms and the memory of small footsteps, and the question of whether anything was ever really there at all. But in some places, the old patterns persist. In some houses, the offerings still disappear. In some storage rooms, the toys are still mysteriously rearranged. In some traditional inns, guests still wake with their pillows moved, still hear laughter in empty corridors, still glimpse small figures in old-fashioned kimono fading like morning mist. In some families, prosperity still seems too consistent to be coincidence, too reliable to be explained by work or luck alone. And in those places, the belief persists that something innocent and ancient dwells in the corners, plays in the shadows, and brings fortune with invisible hands. The modern world has not entirely driven out the Zashiki-Warashi. Not yet. They linger in the spaces between tradition and change, between belief and skepticism, between the old Tohoku and the new. They adapt or they vanish, they stay or they leave, and those who encounter them, or believe they encounter them, carry the stories forward, adding new chapters to the folklore, maintaining the cultural memory of protective child spirits in a world that increasingly has no place for such things. Listen. Listen carefully. Even in modern Tohoku, even in renovated inns and maintained family houses, even in the spaces where traditional and contemporary uneasily coexist, you might hear something. The patter of small feet, the echo of childlike laughter, the whisper of something that chooses to remain even as the world moves on, that continues to protect even as protection becomes less believable, that maintains its eternal childhood even as childhood itself becomes something different in the modern age. The Zashiki-Warashi are fading, perhaps, but they have not vanished entirely. Not yet. Some houses still hold them. Some families still honor them. Some spirits still choose to stay, to play, to guard, even as everything around them changes, even as the world they were born into. The world of desperate winters and buried infants and communities bound by shared tragedy and shared folklore fades into history and memory and story. There is a particular weight to folklore, not the weight of truth or untruth, but the weight of meaning, of cultural processing, of collective psychology working through the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. The Zashiki-Warashi carry this weight. They are not simply ghost stories or superstitions. They are how communities in Tohoku processed one of humanity's darkest acts, the killing of one's own children, and transformed it into something that could be lived with, honored, even treasured. Consider the psychological mechanism at work. Families in Edo period Tohoku practiced infanticide during times of famine. This is historical fact, documented though rarely discussed openly. The euphemisms, thinning, returning to the gods, sending back, indicate the psychological burden of the act. You cannot simply kill your newborn child and feel nothing. You cannot make the terrible calculation that this infant must die so siblings can live and then move forward with ordinary life. The guilt would be crushing, impossible to process without some framework, some story, some transformation of the act into something bearable. And so the dead children became guardian spirits. The infants buried under the floor became the Zashiki-Warashi in the storage room. The terrible sacrifice became a source of blessing. The murdered innocents were imagined not as victims, but as willing protectors, as spirits that chose to guard rather than haunt, to bring fortune rather than vengeance. The families could tell themselves, could allow themselves to believe that the children they killed had transcended that death, had become something powerful and protective, had forgiven, had transformed tragedy into guardianship. This is the profound psychological function of the Zashiki-Warashi folklore. It allowed communities to acknowledge the infanticide without confronting it directly. It allowed families to honor the dead children without admitting they had killed them. It transformed guilt into gratitude. The terrible feeling of, "we killed our child," became, "our child protects us." The moral burden was lifted by reimagining the victim as guardian, by telling stories where the murdered innocent chose to bring fortune rather than haunt with grief. But here is the complexity. This transformation does not erase the tragedy. The Zashiki-Warashi stories are not happy stories. They are profoundly sad. The spirits are eternal children. They cannot grow up, cannot change, cannot escape the form they died in. Their laughter echoes through empty rooms, lonely and endless. Their play is solitary, conducted in corners where no one joins them. They bring fortune, but they experience none themselves. They protect, but they are forever unprotected. They guard families, but no one can guard them from their own condition. Eternal childhood, endless isolation, the terrible limbo of being dead but not gone, transformed but not saved. The sadness in the stories is not incidental. It is central. The Zashiki-Warashi are protective, yes, but they are also melancholic. The image of a small child playing alone for centuries, watching families live and die, bringing fortune while experiencing none, choosing to stay in the house where it was buried rather than moving on to whatever comes after death. This image carries profound sorrow. The spirits save families from ruin, but nothing saves them. They forgive, but they are not released. They protect, but they remain trapped in the very houses where they died, playing out an endless childhood that was stolen from them before it could begin. This sadness serves a psychological function too. It allows the communities to process not just guilt, but grief. The stories acknowledge that something terrible happened to these children, that their deaths were real losses, that they deserved better. The melancholic tone of the folklore honors the dead infants in a way that simple erasure or denial never could. By making the spirits sad as well as protective, the stories admit that infanticide was tragic even when it was necessary, that the children lost something precious even if their deaths saved others, that transformation into guardian spirits was not perfect salvation, but ongoing tragedy. Folklorist Shinobu Orikuchi identified similar protective household child spirits throughout Japan. Okunai-sama in one region, Zashiki-Bozu in another, and variants spreading all the way to Okinawa's Kijimuna. He theorized that these widespread legends represented a universal pattern of communities processing child death and vulnerability through protective folklore. In every region where life was hard, where infant mortality was high, where families made terrible decisions about which children to keep and which to return, similar stories emerged. Stories of child spirits who protected rather than haunted, who brought fortune rather than grief, who chose to stay rather than depart. This universality suggests something profound about human psychology. When communities commit acts they can barely live with, when the cruelty required for survival becomes unbearable, folklore provides a mechanism for processing that burden. The stories do not excuse the acts. The sadness woven through the Zashiki-Warashi legends acknowledges the tragedy, but they make the acts survivable. They transform victims into guardians, guilt into gratitude, the murdered into the miraculous. They allow communities to continue living in houses where children are buried under the floor, to continue as families despite having killed family members, to continue believing in their own basic goodness despite having done something fundamentally terrible. Modern Japan confronts a different kind of tragedy: plummeting birth rates, aging population, the gradual disappearance of children themselves from many communities. The Zashiki-Warashi stories take on new resonance in this context. In the old stories, children were sacrificed so families could survive. In modern Japan, children are not born, and families disappear anyway. The houses stand empty, not because the spirits have left, but because there are no families to occupy them, no children to grow up in them, no one to honor the old ways or remember the old stories. What happens to the Zashiki-Warashi in this world? If they are manifestations of cultural guilt about child death, what form do they take in a culture where the tragedy is not children dying but children never being born? If they are protective spirits tied to specific houses, what happens when those houses collapse from neglect rather than from the spirit's departure? If they are real entities with some form of consciousness, where do they go when the world they were created for, the world of harsh Tohoku winters and desperate families and buried infants transformed into guardians, simply no longer exists? Perhaps they fade. Perhaps as belief fades, as the old houses crumble, as the communities that sustained the folklore disperse to cities, the Zashiki-Warashi lose their ability to manifest, their presence becoming fainter, their footsteps quieter, their laughter more distant, until finally they vanish completely. The last connections to a time when children were sometimes killed so other children could live, and the murdered became the protectors, and fortune depended on honoring the small ghosts in the storage room. Or perhaps they persist, Perhaps some spirits remain in the few old houses that are maintained, in the traditional inns that advertise their presence, in the families that continue leaving offerings and listening for footsteps. Perhaps they adapt to the modern world, finding new ways to manifest, new families to protect, new purposes beyond the original tragedy that created them. Perhaps the spirits are more resilient than the belief that sustains them, more enduring than the houses that contain them, able to survive the transition from traditional to modern, from widespread acceptance to nostalgic curiosity, from cultural reality to tourist attraction. Or perhaps, and this is the most haunting possibility, they wait. Perhaps the Zashiki-Warashi remain in their corners and storage rooms, playing alone as they have always played, bringing fortune or simply existing, while the houses slowly collapse around them. Perhaps they experience the departure of families not as rejection, but simply as continuation of the pattern they have always known. People come, people go, children are born and die or never born at all. Prosperity rises and falls, houses are maintained or abandoned, and they remain eternal children in a changing world, waiting for something they do not fully understand, continuing to protect, even when there is no one left to protect, playing in empty rooms because play is what they are, solitary and melancholic, and faithful to a purpose that may have lost all meaning, but continues nonetheless, because that is what spirits do. They persist. What can we learn from the Zashiki-Warashi? What do these spirits of murdered children, who chose to protect rather than haunt, teach us about guilt and grief, about tragedy and transformation, about the stories we tell to make unbearable things bearable? Perhaps they teach us that forgiveness is possible, even for the unforgivable, that innocence can transcend betrayal, that love can emerge from the darkest circumstances, that the murdered can choose to guard the murderers, and in that choice, something like grace exists. Or perhaps they teach us that transformation is not salvation, that becoming a guardian does not erase the original tragedy, that protection offered does not equal protection received, that eternal childhood is not childhood, but imprisonment, that the spirits who bring fortune experience none themselves, that forgiveness may be possible, but the wound remains, the sadness persists, the small ghost plays alone in corners forever, never growing, never changing, never escaping the form it was killed in. Both lessons are true. Both exist simultaneously in the folklore. The Zashiki-Warashi are protective and trapped, forgiving and melancholic, bringers of fortune who are themselves unfortunate, guardians who need guarding, children who will never grow up because they were never allowed to be children in the first place. They are the murdered innocents transformed into protective spirits, and that transformation is both miraculous and tragic, both grace and ongoing sorrow, both the community processing its guilt and the community admitting that some things cannot be fully processed, some tragedies cannot be completely transformed, some wounds remain open even centuries later, even when covered with stories of fortune and protection and invisible small hands moving pillows in the night. The old houses stand empty now, or they collapse, or they are maintained as museums, as inns, as links to a past that grows more distant each year. The Zashiki-Warashi fade or persist, or wait in the corners. The stories continue to be told, even as fewer people believe them fully, even as they become more curiosity than conviction, more nostalgia than lived reality. And somewhere in Tohoku, in a few old houses that remember when children were sometimes returned to the gods, in storage rooms where infants were buried under the floor, in the twilight spaces where belief and skepticism uneasily coexist, You can still hear, if you listen very carefully, the patter of small feet on tatami, the distant echo of laughter that holds both innocence and ancient sorrow, the whisper of something that chose to protect rather than haunt, that brings fortune to families built on tragedy, that plays alone in empty rooms, eternal and melancholic and impossibly, heartbreakingly faithful. Thank you, small spirits. Thank you for protecting families who sometimes killed you. Thank you for bringing fortune to houses where you were buried. Thank you for choosing guardianship over vengeance, protection over haunting. Thank you for remaining children even in eternal childhood, for playing even in solitude, for bringing laughter even in sadness. Thank you for staying as long as you stayed. And when you finally left, when you walked out the door one dawn, when you waved goodbye with one small hand, thank you for that too. Thank you for everything you gave that you did not have to give. Thank you for protection offered by those who were never protected. Thank you for forgiveness embodied in spirits who had every reason not to forgive. Rest now, if rest is possible for you. Play on, if play is all you have. Depart or remain as you choose. You have done enough. You have protected well. You have brought fortune, honored sacrifice, transformed tragedy, and carried the weight of community guilt with small shoulders for centuries. Whatever comes next for spirits like you, peace or persistence, dissolution or transformation, you have earned it. The tatami remembers your footsteps. The shoji screens still filter the same golden light. The storage rooms still have their corners. The houses may stand or fall. The families may prosper or scatter. The belief may persist or fade. But the story remains. The story of the guest room children, the eternal children, the small spirits who brought fortune with invisible hands, who played alone for centuries, who protected families built on tragedy, who chose guardianship over vengeance, who continue to whisper, even now, in the spaces between old wood and paper, in the silence of empty guest rooms, in the memory of communities that process their darkest acts through stories of protective children, in the folklore that transforms tragedy into guardianship and guilt into gratitude. Listen. The small feet are still pattering somewhere. The laughter still echoes in some old house. The child spirits still play in corners where no one sees them. And as long as the stories are told, as long as someone remembers, the Zashiki-Warashi remain, not quite gone, not quite forgotten, existing in that twilight space where belief and memory and folklore sustain what might have vanished. What perhaps should have vanished, but what continues nonetheless, because some stories are too profound, too necessary, too woven into cultural consciousness to disappear completely, even when the world that created them has transformed beyond recognition. The light is fading now. The shoji screens glow with the last golden rays of afternoon sun, filtering through rice paper into soft amber shadows. The tatami beneath you holds the warmth of the day, releasing it slowly into the cooling evening air. Somewhere outside, a crow calls once, twice, then falls silent. The old house settles into its evening stillness, timbers creaking softly, the wind moving through gaps in the walls with sounds like distant breathing. This is the time when the Zashiki-Warashi were most active, the old stories say. Twilight, the space between day and night, between visible and invisible, between the world of ordinary things and the world of spirits. This is when you might hear them if you listened carefully. This is when you might glimpse them if you were very still and looked without looking, seeing from the corner of your eye rather than directly. This is when the children who never grew up would begin their nightly play, moving through rooms that had been their prison and their home for centuries. But in most houses now, the twilight brings only silence. The guest rooms stand empty. The storage spaces hold nothing but dust and old boxes. The corners where offerings were once left now accumulate cobwebs and forgotten objects. The tatami shows no footprints. The toys remain where they were placed. The pillows stay undisturbed through the night. The Zashiki-Warashi have departed from most of Tohoku. Not all. There are still scattered reports, still families who maintain the old practices, still houses where something inexplicable happens and people whisper about protective spirits. But the widespread phenomenon that Kunio Yanagita documented in 1910, the cultural reality that shaped life in the region for centuries, has largely faded into folklore, into tourist attractions, into stories told by grandparents to grandchildren who listen with polite skepticism. Why did they leave? The question haunts the remaining believers, the folklorists who study the phenomenon, the families who remember when their own houses held these spirits. Was it modernization? The transformation of traditional wooden houses into concrete structures where spirits of murdered infants buried under earthen floors cannot exist? Was it cultural change? The shift from extended family households to nuclear families, from rural communities to urban anonymity, from shared belief to individual skepticism? Was it simply time, the natural fading of all phenomena, spiritual or otherwise, as the world moves forward and the past recedes? Or perhaps, and this is what the oldest people in Tohoku sometimes suggest, speaking quietly as twilight gathers, perhaps the Zashiki-Warashi left because they were, finally, allowed to leave. Perhaps for centuries they remained because the communities needed them, because the guilt required processing, because the murdered children had to become protective spirits, or the weight of the infanticide would have crushed the culture that practiced it. But as memories faded, as the desperate times passed into history, as the practice of mabiki ended and the reasons for it disappeared, perhaps the spirits were released from their obligation. Perhaps they stayed, not because they were trapped, but because they were needed. And when they were no longer needed, when the communities could finally face their history without the transformative folklore, or when the communities themselves disappeared into modernity, the spirits could finally rest. This is a kinder interpretation than believing they were driven out by skepticism or made obsolete by concrete apartments. It suggests that the Zashiki-Warashi served a purpose, fulfilled it faithfully for centuries, and were released when that purpose ended. It transforms their departure from abandonment into completion, from loss into graduation, from tragedy into peace. It allows the remaining believers to imagine the child spirits finally growing up in some spiritual sense, finally moving beyond the eternal childhood that bound them, finally finding whatever exists beyond guardianship for souls that chose protection over vengeance. But we cannot know. We can only observe the pattern, the old houses emptying, the spirits departing or fading, the folklore transforming from lived belief into historical curiosity. We can only note that something that was once culturally real, that shaped life and fortune throughout a region, that sustained families and explained prosperity and brought comfort in harsh times, has now largely vanished, leaving behind empty rooms and questions about what was real and what was believed, and whether that distinction matters as much as we think it does. The anthropologists and folklorists continue to study the Zashiki-Warashi phenomenon. Academic papers analyze the psychological mechanisms, the cultural functions, the historical context. Theories proliferate about what the spirits really were. Collective hallucinations, shared cultural delusions, folk explanations for random fortune and misfortune, metaphors for community guilt, actual supernatural entities, or something more complex that resists simple categorization. These academic analyses provide valuable insight into how communities process trauma through folklore, how guilt transforms into cultural narrative, how the unbearable becomes bearable through stories. But something gets lost in the analysis: the emotional reality of living with these beliefs, the profound comfort of feeling protected by benevolent spirits, the terror of hearing that protection had departed, the melancholic beauty of the stories themselves, with their blend of innocence and sorrow, protection and imprisonment, and forgiveness and ongoing tragedy. The people who lived with Zashiki-Warashi, who heard the footsteps, who felt the cold hands, who left offerings and received fortune, who experienced the devastation of departure, did not experience academic categories. They experienced something emotionally and spiritually real, something that shaped their understanding of their homes and families and fortune. Whether the spirits were objectively real in some scientific sense mattered less than the fact that they were real in experience, real in effect, real in the way they structured daily life and cultural meaning. And perhaps that is the most important legacy of the Zashiki-Warashi. Not whether they existed, but what their existence meant to the people who believed in them. The spirits provided a framework for understanding fortune as relational rather than random, dependent on maintaining right relationship with protective presences, conditional on honoring obligations to beings who brought prosperity, but could withdraw it. They taught that homes were not just physical structures, but spiritual entities with their own inhabitants and requirements. They demonstrated that tragedy could be transformed through imagination and folklore into something protective rather than purely destructive. Most profoundly, they processed the unbearable reality of infanticide by transforming victims into guardians, by imagining murdered children as choosing protection rather than vengeance, by making the dead infants into sources of family fortune rather than sources of horror and guilt. This transformation did not erase the tragedy. The sadness woven through the stories makes clear that communities understood they had lost something precious, but it made the tragedy survivable, made it possible to continue living in houses where children were buried under the floor, made it possible to be families despite having killed family members. Modern Japan, for all its wealth and technological advancement, struggles with different tragedies. The birth rate has plummeted. Children have become rare in many communities. The old extended family structures have dissolved. Young people leave rural areas for cities, leaving behind aging parents in houses too large and too traditional for modern life. The communities that sustained the Zashiki-Warashi folklore have largely disappeared, not through dramatic collapse, but through slow demographic fade, through the quiet abandonment of traditional ways, through the gradual transformation of Japan from a nation of villages and farms to a nation of cities and apartments. In this context, the Zashiki-Warashi stories take on new resonance. They remind us of a time when families were large, when houses held multiple generations, when children were so numerous that communities faced the terrible question of which ones to keep, rather than the modern question of whether to have children at all. They remember a Japan that was poor but populated, hard but communal, harsh but sustained by shared belief and mutual obligation. They preserve the memory of specific relationships, not just between living family members, but between the living and the dead, between families and their houses, between communities and their protective spirits. As this older Japan disappears, as the last people who remember when Zashiki-Warashi were accepted reality rather than folklore pass away, something irreplaceable is lost. Not just belief in specific spirits, but an entire way of understanding the world. A world view where the supernatural was natural, where houses had spirits, where fortune depended on maintaining relationships with invisible guardians, where the dead did not fully leave but transformed into protective presences, where communities processed collective trauma through shared stories that everyone understood and honored, even if they could not fully explain. The loss is both inevitable and melancholic. Inevitable because cultures change, worldviews shift, belief systems that sustained one era cannot always transfer to the next. Melancholic because something beautiful and profound existed in the old ways. The sense of living in an enchanted world where small spirits played in corners and brought fortune, where tragedy could transform into guardianship, where innocence persisted even through horror, where the murdered became the miraculous. Perhaps this is what the Zashiki-Warashi ultimately represent in their twilight, not just specific spirits, but the entire world of traditional belief that is fading from Japan, from Tohoku, from the old houses that once held so much more than furniture and families, that once held stories and spirits, and the complex processing of collective trauma through protective folklore. They represent the passing of a way of being in the world, a way of understanding fortune and misfortune, prosperity and ruin, guilt and forgiveness, tragedy and transformation. And yet, even as they fade, even as the old houses collapse and the belief systems dissolve and the communities that sustain them disappear, the stories remain, the folklore persists, the tales of guest room children who brought fortune and departed in sorrow, of protective spirits born from murdered infants, of eternal childhood and lonely play and invisible guardianship, continue to be told. They are told differently now, as cultural curiosities, as tourist attractions, as academic subjects, as nostalgic memories of how grandparents lived. But they are still told. And in being told, they preserve something essential. They remember that communities in Tohoku faced impossible choices and processed them through beautiful, sorrowful stories. They honored the children who died, whether from infanticide or illness or abandonment, by transforming them into protective spirits rather than forgotten victims. They acknowledge that tragedy can become guardianship, that guilt can transform into gratitude, that the murdered can be reimagined as miraculous. They teach that forgiveness is possible even for the unforgivable, that innocence can transcend betrayal, that spirits can choose protection over vengeance. These lessons transcend the specific historical context. They speak to universal human struggles with guilt and grief, with how to process acts that cannot be undone, with how to continue living after terrible necessity. They demonstrate the power of folklore to transform trauma, the necessity of stories to make unbearable things bearable, the profound human capacity to reimagine even the darkest acts into something that carries meaning rather than just horror. The Zashiki-Warashi will likely continue to fade. The old houses will continue to collapse. The traditional beliefs will continue to transform into historical curiosities. The last people who fully believed will pass away, taking with them the emotional reality of living with protective child spirits. The folklore will persist but changed, more story than belief, more nostalgia than conviction, more museum artifact than living cultural practice. But the stories will endure. They will endure because they are profound, because they touch something essential about guilt and forgiveness, tragedy and transformation, the murdered and the miraculous, because they remember a time when Tohoku communities faced desperate choices and processed them through folklore that honored both the necessity and the tragedy of those choices. Because they preserved the image of eternal children playing in empty rooms, bringing fortune with invisible hands, protecting families built on their own graves, choosing guardianship over vengeance, offering forgiveness to those who killed them. This image, the Zashiki-Warashi in the storage room, the small figure in faded kimono playing with wooden toys in the twilight, the sound of childlike laughter echoing through old houses, the cold, small hands moving pillows in the night, the patter of feet that bring fortune, the terrible silence when those feet finally depart. This image will persist in Japanese folklore, in cultural memory, in the stories told about Tohoku and traditional life, and the spirits that once inhabited the spaces between the living and the dead. Let the twilight deepen now. Let the shadows gather in the corners of the room. Let the tatami cool beneath you as night approaches. Let your breathing slow, matching the rhythm of the old house, settling into evening stillness. And as you drift toward sleep, imagine, just for a moment, that you hear something in the distance, the faint patter of small feet on tatami, the distant echo of childlike laughter, the whisper of something innocent and ancient moving through rooms that remember when children played there, when families prospered under invisible protection, when the murdered became the miraculous and brought fortune instead of grief. The Zashiki-Warashi may be gone from most houses, but in the stories, they remain. In the folklore, they persist. In the cultural memory of Tohoku, they continue their eternal play, their solitary guardianship, their melancholic protection. They are the children who never grew up, who never left childhood because they were never allowed to be children in the first place. They are the spirits of infanticide transformed into protective guardians. They are innocence choosing forgiveness over vengeance, protection over haunting, staying over leaving, at least for a while, at least for centuries, at least until the time came to finally walk out the door one dawn and find whatever peace exists for spirits who served faithfully, who forgave completely, who protected endlessly. Thank you, Zashiki-Warashi. Thank you for the centuries of guardianship. Thank you for transforming tragedy into protection, guilt into gratitude, murdered children into fortune bringers. Thank you for the comfort you brought to families who needed to believe they were protected, who needed to transform their darkest acts into sources of blessing. Thank you for playing alone in empty rooms, for bringing laughter to silence, for moving pillows and leaving footprints and touching faces with cold, small hands. Thank you for staying as long as you stayed, and thank you for leaving when the time came to leave, for finally releasing families from the burden of your protection, for finally finding whatever exists beyond eternal childhood, beyond endless guardianship, beyond the storage rooms where you played for so long. The old houses stand empty now, or they collapse into memory. The tatami shows no footprints. The toys remain undisturbed. The offerings go uncollected. The silence is absolute. No laughter, no footsteps, no cold hands in the night. Just empty rooms in old houses, just twilight filtering through shoji screens, just the ordinary world without its small guardians, without its protective spirits, without the children who brought fortune and departed in sorrow. But somewhere, perhaps in the remaining old houses, perhaps in the traditional inns, perhaps in cultural memory itself, the Zashiki-Warashi persist, still playing, still protecting, still bringing fortune, or being believed to bring fortune, which amounts to the same thing. Still inhabiting the spaces between belief and skepticism, between past and present, between the living and the dead, still pattering across tatami on small feet, still laughing softly in corners, still moving pillows while families sleep, still touching faces with cold small hands, still maintaining their eternal childhood, their endless guardianship, their melancholic protection. Listen for them, not with your ears, but with something deeper. Listen for the patter of small feet that bring fortune. Listen for the laughter of children who died before living. Listen for the whisper of forgiveness offered by those who had every reason not to forgive. Listen for the story of protective spirits born from tragedy, of guardianship chosen over vengeance, of innocence persisting through horror, of small ghosts playing alone in empty rooms, bringing prosperity to families built on their graves, protecting descendants of those who killed them, choosing to stay rather than depart, at least for a while, at least for centuries, at least until the time came to finally leave. The Zashiki-Warashi are fading, but they have not vanished entirely. Not yet. Not while the stories persist. Not while the old houses remember. Not while twilight still gathers in the corners of traditional rooms and creates the space where spirits might exist, where belief might transform into reality, where the impossible might become possible, where the murdered children of desperate times might still be playing in storage rooms, still bringing fortune with invisible hands, still protecting families who may no longer believe but who remember, somewhere deep in cultural consciousness, that once, not so long ago, the guest room children were real. Sleep now. Rest in the knowledge that for centuries, families in Tohoku believed they were protected by small spirits who chose guardianship over vengeance, who brought fortune instead of grief, who transformed the tragedy of their deaths into the miracle of their protection. Rest in the sadness and beauty of that belief, in the profound human capacity to process unbearable guilt through folklore, to transform murdered children into protective guardians, to find forgiveness where none should be possible. The Zashiki-Warashi watch over you still, not really, perhaps, but in the stories, in the memory, in the way folklore persists, even when belief fades. They play in the corners of cultural consciousness, bringing fortune that may be real or may be imagined, but which sustained communities through harsh times, regardless. They laugh in the empty rooms of memory, pattering across the tatami of tradition, moving the pillows of belief, touching with cold, small hands the face of a culture that needed to believe in protective spirits more than it needed to confront the terrible acts that created them. Thank you, small spirits. Thank you for everything. Rest now, if rest is possible. Play on, if play is all you have. Protect or depart as you choose. You have earned whatever peace exists for eternal children, for murdered innocents who became miraculous guardians, for the small ghosts in the guest rooms who brought fortune and left in sorrow, who chose forgiveness and were never fully forgiven, who protected families and were never themselves protected. The story ends here, but the Zashiki-Warashi remain, somewhere in the twilight, somewhere in the old houses, somewhere in the space between belief and memory, between folklore and history, between the tragic children they were and the protective spirits they became. They remain in the stories. They remain in the empty rooms. They remain in the cultural memory of communities that processed their darkest acts through tales of guardian spirits. They remain in the imagination of those who hear their story and feel the profound sadness and beauty of small children playing alone forever, bringing fortune with invisible hands, protecting families from corners where no one sees them, but Everyone knows they are there, or were there, or might still be there, if you listen carefully, if you believe deeply, if you honor the tragedy beneath the protection, if you understand that some stories are too profound to disappear completely, even when the world that created them has vanished. Sleep now. Dream of old houses. Dream of tatami rooms at twilight. Dream of small footsteps bringing fortune. Dream of childlike laughter echoing through empty spaces. Dream of the Zashiki-Warashi, the guest room children, the eternal children, the murdered innocents who became protective guardians, the small spirits who watched over Tohoku for centuries and who still watch, perhaps, from the fading edges of folklore, from the disappearing traditional houses, from the stories that persist when belief itself has faded into memory, into history, into the beautiful melancholic twilight where spirits might exist, if only we believe, if only we remember, if only we honor the tragedy and transformation both, the murdered and the miraculous, the children who were never allowed to grow up but who chose, somehow, to protect rather than haunt, to bring fortune rather than grief, to guard families built on their own graves. Good night, Zashiki-Warashi. Good night, small spirits. Good night, eternal children. Thank you for the stories. Thank you for the protection. Thank you for transforming tragedy into guardianship, guilt into gratitude, murdered children into fortune bringers. Thank you for playing in empty rooms, for bringing laughter to silence, for protecting families who sometimes killed you. Thank you for everything. Rest now. You have done enough.